Good morning, beautiful people of the internet. Today, we're going to go through probably one of the most exciting topics we have to offer in our webinar series. We're going to be looking at policies, we're going to be looking at the admin portal, and we're going to try to sort of discuss some of the key areas that we get asked about in Teams engineering around what are some of the good practices for K-12 and higher ed, and the different types of personas and the way that they will eventually use Teams. And we're going to look at some things like automation and how we can make your life significantly better through automating through some of the tool sets that we have available in Teams and the wider Office 365 solutions. So I'm Jason LaGreca. I lead the Teams for Education engineering product group for the APAC region. My role is more than anything to listen to customers and to get their feedback, but also to provide guidance in times where we need to get you onboarded. In the chat area, so in the question and answer space, we have Megan Towns and we have Claire White. So if you do have questions, please feel free to jot those down and we'll do our utmost to answer those in as close to real time as possible. If there's any questions we can't get to, there is an email address that I think the team will post in the Q&A area now. There's also a blog post that has lots of information that will help you in this journey. So without further ado, I'm just going to bounce through. Now, today, I'm not going to do a lot of slides. I'm going to spend most of my time actually in the Teams and Office 365 admin portals. So if I go through a lot of information, if you miss out on anything, don't worry. This recording will be available to you after the fact. So feel free to share around. And again, if there are any questions, don't hesitate to jot them down inside of the Q&A. Quick agenda. I'm going to spend probably less than 5 minutes talking about Teams for Education. Now, we do have a parallel sort of running stream of webinars run by Megan that's covering off what Teams for Education is, both from a student's perspective, but also from a teacher's perspective. If you're interested in deep diving into the functionalities of Teams, things like assignments, things like grading and rubrics and all of those fun things, please look out for those sessions. They are highly valuable. But this session really today is for the IT pros. For those of you in particular that aren't necessarily advanced users of Teams yet, somewhere in the middle between a beginner and just intermediate. And yeah, so I'm going to just do that very, very briefly. We're then going to look at deployment and some of the strategies around that. We're going to look at governance, which is top of mind for many schools who are looking to get Teams up and running quickly. And then finally, time permitting, we're going to look at the different types of automation that can be done and how we can start that process as well. So this is the 2-second overview of what Microsoft Teams is for education. Now, we refer to this as really the one entry point for everything that you should be doing in your work or school life. So everything from meetings, rich chat experiences, calling, files, third party, second party, first party, and even line of business applications. And I will cover that little piece off a little bit later on. And obviously the fact that Teams is a global platform. It's available in most countries globally. We have a list that's available to you on or in our documentation around where our services are available. And it's a product that's used in multiple languages, including Mandarin Chinese and some of the others that are very important to the APAC region. So for any information on the residency aspect of Teams data and Teams information, please, again, feel free to email us those questions and we can get back to you as well. Just a couple of high-level points. Teams is free for education. So for 250 attendees in an online meeting, which by and large will cover most education scenarios, cloud recording. So this recording that we're doing right now will sit inside of the stream services after the fact. The same is true for your meetings. So for anybody in the education world, to get up and running with Teams is a very cost-effective way. As a matter of fact, most of the people who are in attendance this meeting already have Office 365, and therefore really it's about how do we move your users into the system in an effective and safe manner. However, there are other additional pieces to Teams. So this live event broadcast that we're using today, that's part of an additional licensing piece. And if you needed conference numbers, so phone numbers for telephony, that's another area as well that we can assist with, but it won't be covered in this meeting today. So these are the key points. These are the areas we're going to look at. And we do have lots of documentation around this, should you wish to go off and deep dive later on. The link down the bottom there, and please, Claire or Megan, feel free to add this to the Q&A thread. This is a blog that has been created by the Australian subsidiary, so the Australian team, for our schools, our universities, to really start with Teams. Should you require additional or deeper technical documentation, that's available as well. Please feel free to reach out and we will do our best to get that information to you quickly. So, step one, how do we enable Teams for your users? For Teams to be the most effective or to have the biggest bang for buck, really, it's reliant on 4 separate underlying Office 365 services. The first one is your identity, so Azure AD, having your users available in the cloud or having a cloud identity, having SharePoint Online access, Office 365 groups and being able to create those groups, and finally, Exchange Online. Now, Exchange Online is not a requirement to use Teams, but it does dramatically improve the experience. So when we do cover things like meetings, scheduling meetings, using the calendaring system, all of that is entirely reliant on the Exchange Online service. That's not to say you can't do things like Meet Nows in place of those scheduled meetings. But again, if you do want the true native experience of Teams and what Teams is built to be, then Exchange Online is a very important service. Now, these 4 things are assuming, of course, that your identity, your single sign-on, all those things are inside of the Microsoft 365 stack. However, if you do have students currently using Google Identity, we have documentation on how you can get the most out of Teams with Google Identities as well. Again, I'm not going to be deep diving into Google Identity in Teams today, but if that's a conversation you're interested in or learning more about, that is something that's important to you and your school, we can certainly assist. So again, that email address, feel free to reach out. We will follow up very quickly with additional information and potentially additional conversations. Licensing, I'm not going to cover how you enable licenses for your end users inside of Office 365. We do have lots of documentation on that. There are lots of ways you can enable licenses, be that through the portal or be that through PowerShell. But right now, the assumption will be that all of your users have been assigned at least an A1 education license and have access to the core services that they need through those licensing pieces. The other bit that's really, really important and that I'm not going to go into any great depth today is the way that we distribute the various clients to the various endpoints that you will have across a school or a university. So Teams supports or has native applications for Windows, obviously, Linux, Mac, and then the mobile clients as well. Now, through device management, things like Intune, you're able to push those various apps out to your endpoints. We're not going to go into that today. We may have a subsequent session where we look at endpoint management and how we push out our things through Intune, but today that's not going to be covered. If your end users don't have a device, say an iOS or an Android mobile phone or a Windows desktop or a Mac or a Linux desktop or tablet or, sorry, laptop, the web clients will also work. So if you have a modern web browser, be that Edge, Chrome, Firefox, Safari, then you can absolutely engage with Teams as well. However, from a performance standpoint, there are things that the applications, the native applications, just do better. For the technical folk in the room, things like the caching of statics. bringing down some of those native scripts and vector files that are just part of the way that the user experience works. Having those stored in the app upon initial load will expedite the overall feeling of Teams inside of the client. So some pro tips there. We can delve into network performance and things like that a little bit later on. I have some tips around that, but generally speaking, wherever possible, you want to make sure your end users are using the clients. If that's not possible, making sure they have access to a modern browser, be that Edge, Chrome, or Firefox or Safari, to get the best experience inside of Teams. I think I accidentally clicked on the link, which is kind of hilarious. All right, I don't need that. Thank you. Sorry, my bad. The next piece is governance. Now, this is a really broad topic, and I think a lot of people get quite stressed when we mention governance and what are the best practices around that. I'm not going to give any best practices. As a matter of fact, I don't believe in the word best in terms of practices. I think there are good practices, and each school or each university or even each department within a school will have their own set of unique requirements that really the best practice is making sure that those areas are covered in a way that's best for them. So it's really difficult for us to say, hey, this is the best way to do it for everyone. Really, it's about having a discussion internally around really what are the requirements for your school in terms of security, compliance, etc. Comes down to a couple of phases traditionally. So we have the initial, active, and sunset phasing. I'm not going to go into every one of these key points today, just because we do not have the time to go through it. However, we are going to focus on team creation, both from a manual process, how we go about doing that and enabling end users to create their own teams, and also from an automation standpoint, how we can provision dynamically based on a various number of data sets that you may have. We're then going to look at Teams management. So I'm going to dive into the admin portal, looking at app policies, looking at meeting policies, messaging policies, calling policies, live event policies. I'm even going to go into analytics and reporting as well. If you have a need for us to delve into things like various admin roles, or to really go deep into the core quality dashboard, for example, and I will talk about that in a moment, we are happy to do another follow-up session specific to those areas. Depending on how far down your team's journey you are, there are lots of things that we can sort of keep preparing you for. The last piece we'll talk very briefly around is expiration policies, how we go about renewing and archiving teams. Oftentimes, many large institutions, particularly where they have thousands of courses running, are concerned around having just endless numbers of teams created. There are ways that we can automate the archival processes. There are ways that we can look at automatically deleting teams after X period of time. And we also have the ability to retain data within teams as well. So these are lots of different conversations that I'm hoping to expose you to today, but that hopefully will start a dialogue and a conversation moving forward. So team creation. Now I'm going to jump through this. You have, as a policymaker, as an IT pro, the ability to enable one of two scenarios for your end users. Scenario one is that you allow a subset or everybody in your tenant to create their own teams. That's one piece where, as I go into the Teams interface, and Megan does cover team creation as part of her workflow in the other webinars. So the middle column there is showing the experience for an end user who is allowed to create teams. If you lock it down so that you don't allow anybody to create teams, you're essentially relying on an automated layer to create teams dynamically, then really you're preventing a lot of opportunity in the business for particularly higher ed, but you're securing yourself in terms of naming conventions and the like. So some of the recommendations that we have for K-12 specifically is to ideally evaluate if students should be able to create teams. Now, this is a very personal decision. We see a bit of a mixed bag in this space. For younger students, generally, we find that they don't allow students to create their own teams, and that makes complete sense. Noting full well that students are unable to create class teams by default. There's no way that they can create a class team. They can create other team types, just not class teams. For higher education, it's far more common to see an opening of the creation of teams. The reason for this is inside of higher education institutes, we often have not class specific or class dictated learning opportunities. So we have clubs, we have social groups, we have all sorts of different things happening at a university sector where traditionally students are going off into social media land. They're using WhatsApp, WeChat, etc. to really communicate with one another, where really that's a really great opportunity to bring those students into teams in a way that you can govern and secure. Once students are out in the world of the social medias, really there's no way to provide any oversight to that. Even if they're talking about the university, even if they're learning, even if they're being a part of the wider university ecosystem, unless they're inside of the Teams world, there's no way that you can help them out when things go wrong. So they're just food for thought. I'm not going to go into great depth here in the types of teams, the assumption being that you may have a bit of awareness over this already, but generally speaking, there are 4 different templates available. Now, education is really quite special here. This is not something that's available necessarily to all different types of tenants. Education has class types, PLC community or professional learning community, staff, and other. Students are only able to create other. So even if you open up your Teams environment for the creation of teams, for students, they're not going to be able to create assignments, for example. They're not going to be able to have student facing OneNote class notebooks, for example. They're not able to create staff teams, which are similar to classes, except they don't have the assignments function and they use something called a OneNote staff notebook. So you can kind of rest assured that you're not going to have students randomly creating assignments inside of the system. You are providing them a space which is kind of separate in a sense. Now, before I move into the admin portal, I just wanted to cover off some of the ways that you can bring students into a team quickly. This is often a bit of a sticking point for some teachers because they want to add people manually. There's no automated layer yet. The university or the school hasn't necessarily synced up their student information system, and bringing students in can be done a number of different ways other than manually adding them email address by email address. Firstly, you can send an invitation link out to your students if you happen to know their email addresses, and that's an easy process. You can create a join code. Now, Megan covers this in depth in her webinars, and you can also add a distribution list if that's something that's available to the school or the university, if those distribution lists have been created. The other long-term recommendation, this is the area I want to point on today, is we want to start looking at a more sustainable approach for your teachers, looking at a automated layer. And the reason for that is quite simple. If you have the upstream data, be that in a student information system, in a learning management system, some other random system, even if you have that in multiple systems. So it's not uncommon to have a university with 2 student information systems or a learning management system and a student information system. We can bring that into Teams and create those Office 365 groups dynamically. We can make sure that if a student drops out of a course, we can drop them out of the team. If a new student comes in over time, we can bring them into the team. And that takes a lot of overhead away from the teacher. They shouldn't have to worry too much about who's in their team. They should just concentrate on teaching, which is really the end game here. Now, just one really high level point for this slide. I know it's a dense slide with lots of words on it. If there's anything that you remember from this webinar, is that the experience for different personas within your organization, be they a student, a teacher, an IT pro, or other, can be heavily tailored. So through policies, you can set individual differences for your end users. So what your students see inside of Teams, be that on the global navigation or the left-hand navigation, be that inside of the chat and what they can do inside of chat, be that what they can do inside of the meetings interface, can be different. So you can give your teachers far more access to different features than you can with your students, and that's entirely up to you. In my experience, this is the area that takes the most time for schools to get onboarded, because they want to look through each one of these policies and they want to have a conversation around each one of these policies. The reality is, though, if you're able to get a policy decision maker in the room, if you're able to get the IT pro in the room, if you're able to get someone who's from the teaching staff in the room, then even potentially, depending on if this is a higher ed scenario or a K-12 scenario, even a student representative in the room, to literally go through setting by setting and have a conversation over a 2-hour meeting, you can get it done in 2 hours. It doesn't have to be something that carries on and goes on for weeks. Really, it's about, let's have a conversation around what happens if, for example, we take away Giphies from students. What is the impact to learning and teaching? Or if we don't allow students to turn on their cameras, so the camera that I'm using now, the webcam, what happens if we take that ability away from students? Is that something we need from a IT policy? That's something that's written in black and white? The decision's easy. Let's just switch it off and we're happy. So yeah, definitely having a conversation around that as a one meeting over 2 hours gets things done really, really quickly. So right now I'm going to jump into the admin portal. For those of you that have never used the Teams admin portal or the Office 365 admin portal, this will be really useful. For those of you that are more familiar with the Teams admin portal and the Office 365 admin portal more widely, then I'm going to sort of go over some things that you probably already do every day. So that's, probably not necessarily for you, but there are a couple of pro tips for even the most seasoned users that I just really want to go into. So I'm going to switch over now, bear with me, into my demo tenant. Now, for those of you that are brand new to Office 365 and Office 365 administration, if you log into office.com with your user credentials, you're presented with, at the very top, all of the different applications that are available in your suite of tools. Now, what I'm going to do, I'm not going to go into any one of these. It's just going to launch the app. So if I click on Teams, for example, it's just going to launch the Teams app. What I do want to do is click on admin, and that's going to pop me out to essentially this page here. Now, the Office 365 admin portal for new users can be a little bit daunting. There's a lot of settings, there's a lot of information that's presented to you. I'm not going to go through all of this right now. It's probably overkill. What I am going to do, though, is go right down. So in this first left-hand navigation to an area called Health, and I'm going to go to the Message Center. Now, for those that are new to Office 365, the Message Center is probably one of the most important parts of the entire thing. This is where we in engineering and for wider Microsoft post all of our announcements, things that are just for awareness, like there's a new feature coming or there's an update coming, or things that are really, really important. So if there's something that's going wrong with a service, or we've noticed something happening, we will always post it here. Very, very important that you have a routine in place. You have at least a weekly look through these Message Center notifications, because they will, at least in advance, give you notice of things that may impact your students and end users. So if there's going to be a user interface change, for example, or if you have lots of meeting room systems and there's going to be a UX change that may impact your users and they may get concerned with that, this is where we will tell you that those things are happening. It's far quicker and far more centralized than any of our blogs that we have. And while, yes, we will absolutely be posting blogs, we'll have announcements, we'll have events, all of these different things. This is really where things are centralized. And of course, you can filter by service as well. So if you wanted to filter by Teams announcements or filter by date, etc., we can do that as well. There's also layers at the top here of high importance, things that are urgent and need your attention, and other unread messages and archive messages if you've gone and read things. So that's the first pro tip. The next thing is the Teams Admin Center, the SharePoint Admin Center, and the Exchange Admin Center as a Teams admin are probably three places you will visit more often than not. I'm not going to go into the SharePoint Admin Center other than to note that if you create a team, and you have a SharePoint team. So some of the large universities I work with have dedicated admins for SharePoint. They'll have a dedicated admin for telephony. They'll have a dedicated admin for Teams management. Then they'll have Exchange teams. You can access a lot of the same information from SharePoint. So if someone creates a team, that creates a SharePoint site. So the SharePoint admin will have visibility over what's being created in their environment, as well as the Teams person can look inside of Teams and see what teams have been created and generated. So if you have different layers of administration, that is entirely supported through Office 365 as well. Right now, I'm going to jump into Teams. And it's going to throw me to the Teams dashboard. My dashboard is not very exciting because this is a demo tenant that doesn't have a lot of usage going on. But you can see very clearly that there's some exciting stuff, some clear analytics, etc. Now, pro tip is to scroll down. If you scroll down just a little bit, everything that I am talking about today, in far more depth than I'm talking about it, is covered in our training. So inside of Teams, regardless of where you are, even inside of the Teams user interface, there's a help area. You click on that and you can instantaneously access all of our guides, videos, and resources. So here inside of the Teams admin portal, right down the bottom, we've got lots of training, lots of articles, lots of resources. So if you're starting out in Teams and management of Teams, then this is a really good place to go and to get some additional training. What I am going to do now, I'm going to very slowly find myself going down this list. I'm not going to go into every area. I'm not going to talk about devices, but I will bounce between and I will try to go in a sequential order so that if you wanted to follow along, if this is your first time inside of the Teams admin portal, feel free to do so. Again, if there are questions, feel free to ask those and the team here will do our best to answer those as we move along. So the first one I'm going to go to is Teams and Manage Teams. For those, again, that are looking after a Teams environment, particularly a larger Teams environment, what I'm doing now, you can do obviously in the Teams Admin Center, but you can do it through PowerShell as well. So if there's a certain thing that you wanted to achieve, anything I'm saying now, think that you could do it in a way that's more programmatic if you needed to as well. I'm not going to go into the PowerShell commandlets today, but potentially in the future we could do a module on that as well. So what we have here is our Teams management interface. And in here, we can do a couple of different things. Some of the top of minds are guest access. So if historically you've switched on guest access, but you want to have a bit of an audit around who is using guests inside of their teams, here you'll actually get a list of those teams and you can filter accordingly. So if I had a team that had 25,000 guests, which is a number which would not be supported by a team anyway, but if you had a team with a large number of guests, then maybe that's maybe it's there justifiably, but maybe somebody's adding guests when they shouldn't be. So you can have a quick squiz at that. If I drill down into an individual team, then I can see who is a part of that team and I can see the various ownership of a team. Now in this team, you can see that I've got lots of different owners, which is awesome. However, sometimes you will have teams which get abandoned for whatever reason, or the owner leaves. You may have times where at a university or at a school where your teachers leave and you need to provide ownership or access to that team after the fact to get a new teacher onboarded. This is a way as the administrator, I can control who has ownership over a team. So it's as simple as changing the membership role. I can also drill down into the channels. I can see what's going on, how many channels are being created. I can change the settings within channels. I can pin things from here as well. If I had a teacher saying I want to make something visible, basically you get the same level of control over the teams as the owner of that team would have directly from the admin portal. And then of course I get to tinker around with settings in the same way that I would when I create a team inside of Teams. The next area I'm going to jump into is meetings. I'm actually going to go over devices, locations, and users, and jump straight into meetings. Here, I'm going to look at meeting policies, because this is an area that is probably top of mind for many of you. And what are some of the policies we should have in place to make sure our students are safe and secure and not doing things that are inappropriate on meetings? So as a good practice, again, avoiding the best practice language. Having a knowledge of the types of personas within your organization is a really good thing. So at a school, so in let's say a K-12 environment, you would have teachers, you would have students, you may have a differentiation between junior students and higher students, you would have senior leadership, you would have some level of sub-leadership, you would have admin staff, you would have IT staff, and each one of those is a different persona within the organization. When I create policies in a business or when I create policies for a school or a university, I recommend that you create policies, or in this particular case, see how we've got anonymous access and restricted. I would not use that. I would actually have one for teachers, one for students, one for junior students, one for IT pros. And then I can go ahead and customize the experience based on those different users and then assign those policies to those users. It just ends up being a cleaner experience and you get far more granular control over the experience for different types of users. Now, the global one is the most interesting. And here, again, a really good practice for setting up your policies is to have the global set at the most restrictive policy you can think of. So in the K-12 space, the global policy should be your students. So your students would inherit global by default. Everybody inherits global by default. You want to make sure that when they're added to your Teams environment, when they're added to Office 365, they start with the most restrictive, and then you can add functionality by giving them additional policies later on. So if you get a new teacher for the first day, they're added to Office 365, they go into Teams, they've got the same level of access as what a student would have. But then after you've assigned your policy to that teacher, to that new teacher, they can then inherit the higher level policies and the additional functionalities accordingly. This is the safest way to roll. So my experience tells me that global, you want to keep more restrictive and then layer on different levels of access in those persona-driven policy types. But to go through here, this is the global area. There's a number of layers. Now, unfortunately, we're not going to have time today to go through each and every single policy, but a couple of key ones you may want to avoid. So Meet Now in channels. Now, I spoke about this really briefly at the introduction. If you don't have Exchange Online and you're unable to schedule meetings, Meet Now is a way that you can launch a full meeting experience directly within a channel. Now, in K-12, so particularly with younger students, you probably don't want them creating Meet Nows and live meetings inside of a channel. Really, that's something you would like your teachers to do, to be the facilitator and make sure that there is some level of visibility of what's happening in those meetings. So I can globally turn that off if I want to, and then give teachers permission in their policy to use that functionality. Outlook add-in, not going to talk about that. The next one, audio video. Now, transcription, I don't know why that's turned off by default. Transcription is a really powerful tool that allows you in real time, as I am talking, for example, to have subtitles. Really powerful feature, very good for accessibility. In any scenario, I can't see why you would turn that off. Cloud recording, is that something you want to allow everybody to be able to do, or is that something you only want to let teachers do? Again, that's a unique decision that each school would have to make, but experience tells me I don't let students make recordings by default. Senior students, potentially, I would have a separate persona for them, a separate policy for them, and I would allow that to happen. IP video is one that in K-12 is quite topical. IP video is the ability to use your webcam. Do you want your students to be able to turn their cameras on? Now, if I switch this off for students, then that means regardless of the teacher being able to use it, regardless of the teacher being in the meeting, they will not be able to switch on their IP cameras or their video cameras. Again, my opinion in this matter, again, you need to make decisions that are right for your school and for your students, would be for younger kids to probably not allow this necessarily unless you have some other process in place. My view would be that you prevent students from creating meet nows, you prevent them from being able to create meetings, but allow the camera on. If you do that, then they can't create meetings in the first place. We can have chat switched off as well. But then when they're in a classroom setting, in a remote learning setting, they can turn their camera on when the teacher is present. So that's probably a really good practice. Content sharing, again, similar sorts of controls. Will you allow students to use the whiteboard? Will you allow them to use shared notes in a meeting? Will you allow your participants to gain or give control? So something that comes up often in conversations is, can you prevent students from taking control of things within a meeting? So taking control of the screen or requesting control of the screen. Yes, you can absolutely do that. And as a matter of fact, you can do it in two different ways. One is through policy. The other way is by inviting them correctly in the first place. So as an attendee, as opposed to a presenter. And then participants and guests, this is probably only relevant if you have guest access switched on, which for universities is a separate conversation, often used very heavily for research collaboration, very used for co-teaching as well. It's quite common to bring in co-presenters. So if you have guests in, what kind of access are you going to give that guest inside of meetings? Just want to cover this one area really quickly, and that's meeting settings. I often get asked how to customize, or can we customize the email invitations that go out from Teams? So if you're creating a traditional meeting, you have Exchange Online, you're putting it in the calendar. There are absolutely ways that you can change the logo, the legal URI, the help stuff, the footer, and you can preview that as well. So if you wanted to change and customize that to your school, make sure your school policy is on there as well in terms of meeting attendance, you can absolutely do that. Move on to the next one, messaging policies. Now, this is where the fun police get involved. And I know Townsy is against us locking down things like GIFs and the like, and I kind of agree. But again, same thing applies. We should be creating messaging policies for different types of personas in the business. You may simply have one for students and one for teachers, but you may want to be more granular depending on the age of your students or the capabilities of your students. But messaging policies, do you want your students to be able to delete messages? Yes or no? Do you want them to edit their own messages if they make a mistake? Yeah, absolutely. But again, that's a decision that you need to make as an organization. Read receipts. Do you want the ability for your users to see if someone has read their messages? And you can switch that off to everyone, or you can make it allowable. Giphies, if you did need to switch off Giphy, you can do it here. My advice is not to switch off GIFs, but rather to set, particularly for younger students, the content rating to strict. That means by default, the only level that they can get is strict, which means it's not going to be bringing back inappropriate GIFs through the messaging service. Stickers in conversations, don't turn that off. We love stickers, but we understand if you need to for various reasons. The goal here is you want your teachers to be able to give your students stickers. In that case, it's fine. Turn it off for students, create a secondary policy for teachers, and allow teachers to give students stickers. That's entirely doable as well. The one area where I would recommend you switch off for students is the ability to send priority notifications. Priority notifications are great for teachers because it allows them to ping their students, and their students will constantly get bombarded until they've acknowledged a message has come through. But you don't necessarily want your students being able to send priority notifications to teachers, particularly if things happen outside of hours. So yeah, just be cognizant of that. Next area I'm going to talk about really briefly are apps. Now, Teams is most powerful and most useful when you're bringing in the apps that your teachers and students need to use to get their jobs done. Now, in education, there are lots of apps that are out of the box and can be plugged and played inside of Teams, but there's more to Teams than just the third-party apps that you know and love. At a university, for example, you probably have lots of line of business applications that are critical to different personas in the business. You know, things like custom forms that you may be using to order catering, as a really good example. That's a form, or that's an application that you could package and stick inside of Teams and make available to everyone, so they're not having to hunt through different websites to get what they need. Now, I'm not going to cover how you upload new apps or how you create custom apps inside of Teams. However, we do have a website, and I'll share the link to this later on, that lists a whole bunch of app templates that we've created. Now, these are all open source, everything from company communicators, FAQ plus. So if you wanted to create an FAQ knowledge base for all of your Office 365 stuff, how to do learning and teaching inside of Teams, all of that is totally available today. HR support bots, custom stickers app, which is taking the stickers that we've done, but making your own stickers. Icebreaker bot, Scrum status bot, crowdsourcer bot, you name it, there's lots. But the one that's really, really kind of cool is the attendance app. So as we move increasingly to either blended learning or distance learning, remote learning, being able to take attendance inside of Teams is a really useful tool. Now, this is an app that's available. You can obviously deploy it and then have it sideloaded directly into Teams, which makes it available to all of your teachers. You could even pre-pin that directly to the left-hand navigation. So every time a teacher logs in to Teams, they see the attendance app in their left-hand navigation, which is a really useful way to make sure that, you know, we're pushing those behaviors of taking attendance. If I go back to my managing apps, in order to do that, we have two different layers of policies for applications inside of Teams. The first one is permissions. Permission policies in applications allows you to create a whitelist or a blacklist of applications that your teachers or your IT pros are allowed to use. Now, we have hundreds, literally hundreds of apps that are out of the box inside of the App Store, inside of Teams. You may want to water that down a little bit. To do that, we can allow all Microsoft apps, that's a given. Third-party apps, we can allow specific apps, and that's where you create a whitelist. We can block all the apps and then allow, you know, just a few apps through. And then tenant apps, these are the apps that I was referring to earlier. These are your line of business apps, your custom apps. It could be as simple as creating a SharePoint site and pinning that as a button in the left-hand navigation. As a matter of fact, that's a really good way to get your teachers engaged with professional development, is to pin the Microsoft Educator community or a course within the Microsoft Educator community as an app inside of the left-hand navigation. And I'll show you exactly how to do that right now. These are setup policies. Again, persona driven. If I wanted to have the navigation different for teachers to what I have for students, that's entirely doable. It just means I have to create those persona driven policies and assign them to the right people. Now, if I go into add, you'll see that this navigation here, this list of apps that I've got correlates to what's in the left-hand navigation inside of Teams. I can select one of these and, you know, I can change the order if I wanted the activity for some reason to be lower than chat. I could delete activity if I wanted to. I can delete the calendar. I can, you know, delete files, whatever it is. But then I can add my own apps. So if I had another app that I wanted to add, be that a tenant level app, which is that SharePoint site, or it's a line of business application that you've inserted into Teams. It could be the attendance app. It could be Microsoft Educator Community as an app. I can put that directly in the left-hand navigation, top of mind. It could even be a link to your student information system. You know, if that's something you're expecting students to, or teachers, sorry, to use every single day, absolutely pin that. As a matter of fact, we're working with lots of providers, some of our friends that we have in EdVale and Central and other organizations, to have those apps available inside of here so we can pin them for teachers directly, so they're not having to bounce between multiple logins. So that's how you go about pinning apps inside of Teams. The next one I really wanted to talk about, well, there's two, is analytics and reporting. So if you're adopting Teams and you're starting to ramp up and trying to get a hold of kind of how people are utilizing Teams, analytics and reporting out of the box will give you a fairly good view on how people are using Teams today. I can select various reports. I can look at user activity, device statistics, so the kinds of devices they're using to access Teams, live event usage if I wanted to see if my teacher's using live events, et cetera, et cetera. However, there's one better way to get more data than that. And I would recommend that you learn, particularly if you're doing meetings, particularly if you're a network administrator and if you have lots of Wi-Fi endpoints, you have lots of devices in your network, you're having students and teachers complain about network performance. The Core Quality Dashboard is the tool that we use to get visibility on all of those endpoints. It's able to get very granular information around that. But it's not just the Core Quality Dashboard inside of the Teams admin portal that's really powerful. For me, as a Power BI user, we actually have the ability to use Power BI to analyze core quality data. As a matter of fact, there's a report within Core Quality Dashboard dataset, so within this Power BI templates that are available open source in GitHub, to take attendance or to see the attendance within meetings if that's something that you desperately need. So that's available, lots of detailed information. I'm not going to dive into Power BI and how you can analyze all of your reports there. If it's an interesting conversation for you, if you have access to Power BI and you really want to dive deep into your usage reports inside of Teams and telephony and video conferencing, audio conferencing, quality, network performance, this is really the best way to do it. The next area, I'm actually going to bounce back into, just cognizant of time, my presentation, which bounced me out, but that's all good fun, is automation. There are lots of different ways we can automate much of what we've just discussed, and even better, automate the creation of teams to make the lives of teachers easier. The first way is School Data Sync. Now, School Data Sync is a Microsoft service. It's part of any education tenant, sds.microsoft.com to log in. And what it does is essentially give you a profile that you can sync to one or multiple profiles to sync to multiple data sources. It really is the translation layer between your student information data and Office 365 groups, other Office 365 services, and of course, Teams and Teams enrollments. If you have a OneRoster compliant student information system, and there's a growing list of those, then it's a matter of just synchronizing those across. There's even a mechanism to bring in CSV files. So if your student information system is capable of exporting CSV files and you didn't want to go the extra mile with a PowerShell script, you can even take those files via a flow and throw those through School Data Sync and have the automation running at on a scheduled basis. Again, I'm happy to work with anyone that's interested in getting School Data Sync up and running, but I'll just really quickly bounce to what School Data Sync admin looks like and how you go about starting on that journey. So let's go back to I've got so many things open right now. Here, there we go. Come here, my friend. All right, School Data Sync. So yeah, School Data Sync, sds.microsoft.com. It's not using the Office 365 domain. Not sure why, but if you log into School Data Sync, really this is a blank slate. There's nothing here yet. School Data Sync has the concept of sync profiles, and each profile correlates to a data source. Now, it's really, again, really common for, let's say, large districts in the United States, or even here in Australia, New South Wales would be an example, where you have multiple student information systems pushing data into a single source, like School Data Sync or some other middleware. Now, here we're able to create as many profiles as we need to match up with those various systems. Those systems don't even need to be the same. They could be completely different systems if we needed them to be. The other advantage of using School Data Sync is it's highly scalable. So even if you had 5 million users, you could totally use School Data Sync. As a matter of fact, we have customers at that scale using School Data Sync to synchronize their users into Teams and Office 365 groups. Creating a profile is super simple. Sadly, I don't have time to go into all of the various, let me just grab my password. I've been signed out, that's a bit sad. Yes, I would like to stay signed in, that'd be super. Cool. So once I'm logged in, I get the option of either using CSV files, which, to be honest, is the way that many schools operate. And that's because their student information systems may not be OneRoster compliant. We are working today with Central to give them a direct API-driven integration with Teams. But yeah, the idea is you upload CSV files, you have a couple of different formats to choose from. We have lots of documentation around that formatting, the file naming conventions, the headers, and the required data. So if you are able to customize the type of data that comes out of your student information system, then leave that in a spot that's central. It doesn't even have to be in the cloud. It could actually be on-prem. School Data Sync has a sync tool, which is basically a gateway between your on-prem and the internet, that we can take those files and suck them up using Flow, essentially, to this School Data Sync API. But if I give this a name, you'll see that we're presented with lots of different options. I can either upload these files manually or, again, through the API. I get to look at the various properties and sort of match things up. So if I have a different naming convention, or if I wanted to make sure I'm using, the various attributes in different ways, I can make sure that things are synced correctly and that the naming goes through to correlate to the correct thing inside of Office 365. And I can talk about sections. Now, sections are for K-12, basically your class group, and everything here works off identifiers. Everything has a unique identifier. Your students have a unique identifier. The class group has a unique identifier, and most student information systems generate that unique identifier. Alternatively, you could be using a naming convention in place of that, SAS identifier. One really cool feature of using SDS, and something that as a teacher myself, I really, really enjoy, is the ability to delay student access. Now, this means that even though SDS under the hood is synchronizing those users, it's adding the AAD attributes, which is how this fundamentally works. It's adding attributes to each user inside of AAD. It's not going to let those users into my team until we are ready to do so. That gives me, the teacher, an opportunity to set up my team in advance, set up my channel structure, set up my tabs, set up my OneNote class notebook, other resources, apps, you name it. And then when we're ready, we go and students come in. That's a really good way of, it's kind of like a publish function for your team, which is a really powerful tool. And then, of course, you can set when you want the synchronization to stop. So if you have a census state, that could be when the synchronization stops, doesn't need to be done anymore, or it could be at the end of a semester. Through the same mechanisms, we can also archive teams dynamically as well. Now, cognizant of time, just wanted to bounce back to some other options that we have available to us. So PowerShell, which is my favorite friend, is the way that I'm assuming many of you are familiar with. Everything that we've said thus far, be that the creation, control, and assignment of policies can be done through PowerShell. The creation of teams can be done through PowerShell. A caveat, of course, for education, and I'm sure many are familiar, is that if you're creating class teams, you need to use or assigning templates to teams using a production version of the PowerShell module. So 0.96, so the beta module is a requirement for that. If you get stuck for whatever reason, please do send us an email and we'll be sure to point you in the right direction. But yeah, anything that you want to do, you can automate or semi-automate or push out programmatically via PowerShell. As a matter of fact, we have a PowerShell module now, or a script that we've created that can take Canvas courses, the enrollments within Canvas and all of that fun stuff, and push them out into teams, because we know that learning management systems are, for many, the source of truth for that student information and relational data. The other option is Graph API. Now, Graph is more powerful, again, for many. So if you're building an app, you're building a middleware component, you want to have a lot of granular control, the Graph is really the best place to achieve that. Now, for those that are true PowerShell enthusiasts, such as myself, PowerShell can call Graph API as well. So if you wanted to use PowerShell to do really deep integrations and to self-provision channels and tabs and pre-pin apps and all of those fun things that you can do through Graph, you can actually do that in PowerShell too. It's just calling the Graph API. So that's possible. Now, with these three different levels, there, of course, are lots of different options to developers for building integrations, and obviously for the IT pro to choose what is the best mechanism for them. In my opinion, to get up to speed quickly, I would start with School Data Sync. So if I was put against the wall and said, how are you going to make this work tomorrow? School Data Sync for me would be the best option. If I was a PowerShell enthusiast and I had a team of people, or I had an individual who was very well versed in PowerShell, I may choose that route. Graph API, while incredibly powerful and gives you immense granular control over essentially every aspect of Office 365 or M365, including Azure, is great, but the amount of development work required to get up and running quickly takes a lot longer. So just food for thought in that area. This is a graphic about School Data Sync. Sort of went over it already. It's taking your student information system data, translating that, adding attributes to each user inside of AAD, so that all your timetabling, your class lists, relational information. We have a detailed schematic of what that looks like. If anyone's interested in the attributes that are being populated in AAD, we do have that information. So feel free, again, reach out to that email address and we will do our utmost to get back to you with that detail. And then from that, it can translate into Microsoft Teams, OneNote, Office 365, and again, Microsoft Intune as well for device management. Kind of covered this. I spoke more than I showed slides. This is a pretty slide. This is really talking about the various areas we can get help with School Data Sync. School Data Sync themselves, while they aren't necessarily part of the team's engineering team, we are very close friends. We talk all the time. They do have a team that is helping schools or helping even student information system providers to get onboarded with Teams. There is deployment support. So if you do need customized School Data Sync support, there is a link there, aka ms/SDS sign up, and that can help expedite your onboarding through School Data Sync as well. So please don't hesitate to reach out if you need those links. This deck, I'm sure, will be available after the fact as well. Some next steps. Look at that. I came almost perfectly to my timing. Highly unexpected based on the amount of caffeine I've consumed this morning. So remote learning. So there is a link to our blog post, which is for the Australian team, Microsoft Remote Learning, aka ms/Microsoft Remote Learning. We also have a bunch of webinars running right now. We have Australian webinars. We also have ones from our friends and my peers in the United States. My good friend Dominic over in Seattle is running lots of webinars as we speak. So feel free to drop in on any of those. They're really informative, can help you out a long way. And we also have the Teams Academy, aka MS/Teams Academy. For getting your teachers onboarded, I don't have that link here. I would highly recommend they visit the Microsoft Educator community. That for me is probably the best way to get them onboarded in learning the fundamentals of Teams outside of the webinars that Townsy and the rest of our team are offering. So feel free to add that as a link here as well. I think it's highly valuable. And yeah, again, that email address for those that want follow-up information, oz-edu@microsoft.com. If you have questions, if you have concerns, if you have anything that's stopping you, we want to know about it. Happy to help anyone that needs our help. But yeah, in a nutshell, I hope you all have an awesome day. Happy teaming, happy adminning, and yeah, go out and enjoy the sunshine. It's been a while.